The story of Mitzi Sanchez, the girl who escaped a kidnapper. She was only 8 years old, walking home on her birthday when her life changed forever. This is the powerful story of Mitzi Sanchez, the little girl who escaped a kidnapper and proved that courage can overcome even the darkest moments. Stay with us to hear how Mitzi survived, fought back, and turned her pain into a mission to help others. If her story inspires you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It could help someone else too. There's a moment every parent dreads, that first request for independence. Can I walk home alone? The words hang in the air, heavy with both promise and peril. In August 2000, on the sun-dappled streets of Vallejo, California, one such moment would shatter not just a family's peace, but America's collective sense of security. The Sanchez family was preparing for a celebration. Their youngest, Mitzi, was turning 8, an age where children begin testing the boundaries of their world. Born on August 12, 1992, Mitzi embodied the fearless spirit of childhood. She was the kind of girl who chased butterflies and climbed trees, who believed in the inherent goodness of her quiet suburban neighborhood. That fateful afternoon of August 12, 2000 began like any other. The kitchen counter in the Sanchez home was already cluttered with birthday preparations, a homemade cake waiting to be decorated, carefully wrapped presents arranged in a colorful display. The air was thick with anticipation and the sweet scent of vanilla frosting. Mitzi couldn't contain her excitement. When the final school bell rang at 4 o'clock, she made an impulsive decision that would change everything. She wouldn't wait for her older brothers as usual. After all, it was her birthday and home was just a few blocks away. She knew the route like she knew the lines on her palm. Past Mrs. Johnson's rose garden, right at the stop sign, straight past the park. But halfway home, something made her pause. A parked car, a stranger's eyes. Later, she would recall how those eyes seemed to cut through the warm afternoon air like shards of ice. Something primitive stirred in her 8-year-old consciousness, an instinct as old as humanity itself. Without fully understanding why, Mitzi crossed to the opposite side of the street, her small shoulders tense beneath her backpack. The birthday decorations continued to flutter in the gentle breeze back home, oblivious to the darkness that was about to descend upon their celebration. The Sanchez family was still arranging party favors and checking the time, unaware that their world was balanced on a knife's edge, about to tip into a nightmare that would force every parent in America to question, how well do you really know your neighborhood? How safe are your children in those few blocks between school and home? Mitzi's instinct screamed at her to stay away from the man in the car. There was something unsettling about the way his eyes followed her every move. She had learned in school that predators often watch their prey before attacking, and this thought sent chills down her spine. She decided to cross the street, hoping to put some distance between them. The man, however, had other plans. As soon as he noticed her trying to leave, he smoothly stepped out of his car. His voice was gentle and friendly as he called out to her, pointing at his side mirror that hung loosely from its mount. "Excuse me, miss, could you help me for just a moment?" he asked, his face wearing a kind smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told her a compelling story about falling off his bicycle and injuring his leg. To make his tale more convincing, he put on quite a show, limping dramatically and clutching his car for support. He explained that he needed some tape that had fallen between the seats, but his injury prevented him from reaching it. His performance was so convincing that even a cautious person might have believed him. Mitzi's kind heart betrayed her that day. Despite her initial unease, she felt sorry for the seemingly injured man. It will only take a second, she thought to herself as she approached the passenger side of the car. The man stood close by, directing her to look between the seats for the non-existent tape. The moment Mitzi leaned into the car, everything changed. With surprising strength and speed, the man shoved her inside and slammed the door. The sound of locks clicking into place echoed in her ears like thunder. Her screams filled the car as she desperately pulled at the door handles. But it was useless. The child locks were engaged. The man who moments ago could barely walk now moved with the agility of an athlete, jumping into the driver's seat and speeding away. The street, usually busy with life, was eerily empty, something the kidnapper had carefully planned. No witnesses, no help, no chance of rescue. The perfect crime unfolding in broad daylight. Meanwhile, at Mitzi's school, her brothers were just finishing their classes. They waited at their usual meeting spot, expecting to see their sister's smiling face. When they learned she had already left, they assumed she was eager to start their family celebration. The boys hurried home along their regular route, worried about being late themselves. The horror of discovering their sister wasn't there would soon shatter their peaceful afternoon. The car's interior became Mitzi's prison cell. Her desperate pleas and tears went unanswered as the man methodically secured her with a chain and lock. The coldness of his actions, the way he completely ignored her humanity, was perhaps more terrifying than any angry outburst would have been. The shopping center parking lot where they stopped was eerily abandoned, chosen deliberately for its isolation. In a secluded corner, hidden from any potential passersby, the man thrust a paper bag at Mitzi. Inside were unfamiliar clothes. His command to change was clear, and Mitzi, understanding the precarious nature of her situation, complied silently. Her school uniform, the last connection to her normal life, disappeared into a nearby trash bin. The appearance of a gun marked a turning point. The threat was explicit. Attempt to escape, and her life would end. The weapon's presence seemed to drain the last remnants of hope from the car's atmosphere. What followed was equally sinister. A bottle containing a bitter liquid that he forced her to drink. The strong alcohol overwhelmed her young system, and after a second forced drink, consciousness slipped away from her grasp. When Mitzi regained awareness, her surroundings had changed drastically. The abandoned house stood as a silent witness to unspeakable crimes. Her attacker had chosen this desolate location carefully, far from any possibility of help or rescue. What happened next would haunt Mitzi forever. The degrading photographs, the violations, the complete loss of control over her own body. Hours later, Mitzi awakened to complete darkness, her head pounding from the forced intoxication. Confusion gave way to stark realization as memories filtered back. The gravity of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. Alone in the darkness, tied to a car door in an unknown location, Mitzi's thoughts turned to her family for the first time since her abduction. She imagined them at home, perhaps gathering for what should have been a celebration. Were they searching for her? Did anyone witness what happened? The isolation of her location suddenly felt overwhelming. She was truly cut off from everyone who loved her. Meanwhile, at the Sanchez household, panic had replaced joy. Their daughter's absence had transformed their home from a place of anticipated celebration into one of mounting dread. The sun was setting, and Mitzi was still nowhere to be found. Hours had passed since anyone had last seen her, and her parents' worry was growing with each passing minute. They had called everyone they could think of, all of Mitzi's friends, their parents, and even the neighbors. The only thing they knew for certain was that she had left school at 4 o'clock that afternoon. After that, it was as if she had disappeared into thin air. "Did anyone walk home with her?" her mother asked repeatedly, her voice trembling as she made call after call. But no one had. No one had even seen which direction she had taken after leaving the school grounds. The Sanchez family checked every possible place: the local park, the library, the small candy store Mitzi loved to visit. But there was no trace of their 8-year-old daughter. With darkness approaching and their hearts heavy with fear, they finally made the call to the police. The response was immediate and intense, more than they had expected for a child who had been missing for just a few hours. Police cars arrived quickly, and officers began asking detailed questions about Mitzi's appearance, what she had been wearing, and her usual routes home from school. What the Sanchez family didn't know at first was that their neighborhood had been living under a shadow of fear. 2 other young girls had recently vanished in similar circumstances. The first was Amber Swartz, just 7 years old, who had been playing in her front yard one sunny afternoon. Her parents had been home just inside the house when she vanished without a trace. The kidnapper had been bold enough to take her in broad daylight right from under her parents' noses. Then came the disappearance of Sheena Fairchild, another 7-year-old. Like Amber, she had vanished near her home without leaving any clues behind. No screams, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, just an empty sidewalk where a little girl had been walking moments before. The police had kept these cases relatively quiet, hoping to avoid causing panic in the community. But word had spread through worried whispers between neighbors, especially since all 3 disappearances had happened in the same area. In fact, one of the girls had lived just a few blocks away from Mitzi's house. The investigators had a theory they weren't sharing with the public yet. They believed they were dealing with a serial kidnapper who might have committed even more crimes they didn't know about. The speed and efficiency of the kidnapping suggested the perpetrator was using a vehicle, but beyond that, they had few leads to follow. As night fell completely, the Sanchez family sat in their living room, surrounded by police officers, and desperately hoping for any news about their daughter. They couldn't help but wonder, was Mitzi now in the hands of the same person who had taken Amber and Sheena? And more importantly, was there still time to find her? The shadows of 3 vanished children hung over Vallejo like a dark cloud. First she, then I, and finally Amber, each disappearing within months of each other, with the last vanishing 8 months before Mitzi's case. Hope of finding them alive had withered in the minds of law enforcement, though their families still clung to it with desperate determination, their faith unwavering despite the passage of time. Vallejo streets, once bustling with playing children, had grown eerily quiet. The police department found itself walking a tightrope, needing to maintain public calm while hunting a predator who seemed to know their city's rhythm like a native son. Mitzi Sanchez's disappearance bore the same haunting hallmarks as the others. A child vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions and hollow leads. The timeline was clear but cruel in its simplicity. They knew when she left school, which direction she took down that sparsely populated street. During working hours, when most eyes were turned away from the world outside their windows, a child could indeed slip from sight like morning mist. The detectives worked methodically, their footsteps echoing down every street she might have walked, their questions met with the same frustrating response. No one had seen anything unusual. Their profile of the kidnapper grew more refined. This had to be someone who belonged to Vallejo's landscape, someone whose presence raised no eyebrows, whose familiarity with the city's layout allowed them to move like a ghost through its streets. The timing, the locations, the precision, it all pointed to a local predator hiding in plain sight. As the police built their theory, Mitzi's family mobilized the community. Volunteer groups sprouted across the city like wildflowers after rain, their determination manifesting in the form of flyers plastered on every available surface. Each paper bore Mitzi's smile and her family's contact information, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Then came the first tangible lead. A blood-soaked blanket discovered in a nearby dump, its owner reaching out to authorities with trembling hands. But even this evidence proved to be another dead end, the DNA failing to match Mitzi's profile. Unknown to them then, their quarry was already in motion, traveling beyond city limits with his young victim in tow, leaving behind a web of fear and confusion that would only grow tighter in the days to come. The kidnapper seemed to take pleasure in flaunting his power, driving boldly through the city as if daring someone to catch him. He would park in busy areas, sometimes right where police cars patrolled, knowing they had no idea the missing girl was just feet away from them. Inside the car, Mitzi sat frozen with fear. Even when people walked close by, she couldn't bring herself to make a sound or signal for help. The terror had taken complete control of her body and mind. Hour after hour, the man drove around the Bay Area, never staying in one place too long. He was clever in his movements, constantly changing locations to avoid drawing attention. At night, he would drive to quiet spots outside the city where no one would notice them. During these endless hours, Mitzi's situation grew worse. The man would stop to eat at restaurants, but he never gave her any food or water, only alcohol. It was as if he wanted to watch her slowly waste away, taking a cruel pleasure in her suffering. After 2 days without proper food or water, Mitzi's strength was fading fast. In a rare moment of courage, she asked him where they were going. His answer showed just how twisted he was. He told her he wanted to watch the news to see her mother crying about her disappearance. The thought of her mother's pain broke Mitzi's heart all over again. The kidnapper's cruelty reached new heights when he parked in the city and walked into a cafe to watch the news. Just as he had hoped, Mitzi's family was on TV. Her mother's face appeared on the screen, tears streaming down as she begged the public for help in finding her daughter. While Mitzi suffered alone in the car, the man stood there watching her mother's despair with obvious enjoyment. When he returned to the car, he had something to show Mitzi, a missing person flyer with her photo on it. With a sick smile, he told her how he had talked to a volunteer who was handing out the flyers, pretending he wanted to help with the search. It was all a game to him, taking pleasure in fooling everyone while keeping his victim just out of reach. He seemed to enjoy not just the act of kidnapping, but the pain and worry he was causing to everyone involved. The second morning of her captivity brought a new kind of torture. The kidnapper parked the car and left Mitzi alone for hours under the merciless California August sun. The vehicle turned into an oven, the heat pressing down on her already weakened body. Without water for days, her throat felt like sandpaper, and every breath seemed to burn her lungs. Through a small gap in the window, she could see people walking past, living their normal lives, completely unaware of her suffering just feet away. Though she saw potential rescuers everywhere, the terror that gripped her was too strong. She could only watch through tears as her chances for rescue walked by, one after another. In what she believed might be her final hours, Mitzi's thoughts turned to a conversation with her uncle about salvation and forgiveness. Convinced she was going to die in this metal furnace, she began to pray, asking forgiveness from each member of her family. Her prayers carried all the desperation of someone who believed they were facing their end. As evening approached, the kidnapper finally returned and drove to an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The streets were empty here, the buildings abandoned and silent, another carefully chosen spot where no one would notice them. He parked the car and went into a small store, leaving Mitzi alone once again. But this time, something was different. Through her exhausted haze, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. A set of keys left carelessly on the seat. Among them, one key stood out, smaller than the others. It seemed to call to her. Looking at her chains, then back at the key, Mitzi felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. The paralyzing fear that had held her captive even more effectively than the chains suddenly gave way to a surge of desperate courage. With trembling hands, she grabbed the keys and found the small one. Time seemed to stop as she tried it in the lock binding her, and it turned. Freedom was so close now. After releasing herself from the chains, she crawled over to the front seat. Though the doors were locked, the slightly opened window offered a chance. Despite her weakness, despite her fear, she began squeezing her body through the narrow gap. She was halfway out when she heard it, the sound of footsteps, then a shout that made her blood run cold. The kidnapper had returned, purchases in hand, and was yelling for her to get back in the car. The moment Mitzi saw her chance, she knew she couldn't go back to that car. Back to the horror she had endured. Her heart pounding, she ran down the empty street as fast as her tired legs could carry her. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footsteps of her kidnapper getting closer and closer. Despite being weak from her ordeal, fear gave her strength, but it wasn't enough. The man was gaining on her with each step. The industrial area around them was like a ghost town with empty buildings and not a soul in sight. Mitzi's hope was fading with each desperate step until she heard it, the rumble of an engine. Like an answer to her prayers, a pickup truck was turning onto the street. Without thinking twice, Mitzi made a decision that could have cost her life, but might also save it. She ran straight toward the truck, nearly getting hit, and before anyone could react, she pulled herself through the open window with strength she didn't know she had. Inside the truck, she found herself face to face with a young man who looked startled but concerned. Between quick breaths, Mitzi managed to tell him her name and that she had been kidnapped. The fact that she would rather jump into a stranger's truck than stay on the street showed just how terrified she was of her kidnapper. The young driver proved to be her guardian angel that day. As the kidnapper approached the truck, the driver's presence seemed to break his confidence. They watched as the man turned and ran back to his car, but the driver was smart. He quickly memorized the license plate and got a good look at the kidnapper's face. He then turned his attention to Mitzi, offering her water and comfort while he called the police. This call changed everything. Until then, the police had been searching blindly for the missing 8-year-old girl. They had no leads, no direction, and Mitzi might have become just another sad story in the news. But now, armed with a detailed description of both the kidnapper and his car, plus the license plate number, they finally had something to work with. Within hours, they caught him. The kidnapper was identified as Curtis Dean Anderson, a 43-year-old man whose capture brought immense relief to everyone involved. When Mitzi saw his photograph during identification, she broke down in tears. She kept asking if he was really locked up, needing to be sure that her nightmare was truly over. Her fear was still raw, but she was safe now. The story of Mitzi's escape spread quickly through the community. When she finally returned home, she found not only her tearful parents and relatives waiting, but also dozens of neighbors and community members who had been praying for her safe return. Her bravery and quick thinking, combined with the kindness of a stranger, had prevented what could have been a tragic ending. Instead, it became a story of hope and the goodness that can still be found in people, even in the darkest moments. The entire incident served as a reminder of how a single moment of courage, both from Mitzi and the young truck driver, could change the course of events so dramatically. Their split-second decisions that day not only saved Mitzi, but also ensured that a dangerous predator was taken off the streets, preventing him from harming any other children. The police station buzzed with unprecedented activity that day. The halls were packed with an odd mix of grateful volunteers who had participated in the search operation and eager journalists hunting for their next headline. The air was thick with tension and the clicking of camera shutters, each reporter hoping to capture the face of the man who had terrorized their community. In the stark confines of the interrogation room sat Curtis Anderson, a face all too familiar to the local law enforcement. His criminal record, though significant, had never hinted at the darkness that would later emerge. Before this devastating kidnapping, Curtis had been what many would consider a small-time criminal, primarily involved in thefts and robberies. His encounters with the law had been frequent but relatively minor, leading to lenient sentences and even probation. Through calculated good behavior, he had managed to slip through the system's cracks, serving abbreviated sentences that, in hindsight, seemed tragically inadequate. The capture of Curtis Anderson was nothing short of miraculous, a rare instance where fate had smiled upon the investigation. As detectives dug deeper, a chilling possibility emerged. Could this man be the key to solving the mysterious disappearances of Shiana and Amber? The scope of investigation expanded, with authorities considering whether Anderson might be responsible for a string of child disappearances across multiple states. Initially, Curtis maintained a wall of silence, his demeanor cold and uncooperative. But as the interrogation progressed, cracks began to appear in his facade. Within 48 hours, he not only confessed to Mitzi's kidnapping, but also revealed his role in Shiana's disappearance, going so far as to mark the location of her remains on a map. When questioned about Amber, he acknowledged his guilt but seemed to take pleasure in withholding the precise location of her body, playing a twisted game with investigators. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Anderson claimed responsibility for the deaths of 13 children. Yet, this confession came with a cruel twist. He refused to provide names or locations, leaving authorities to grapple with an impossible puzzle. His behavior during these revelations suggested a man who derived satisfaction from the uncertainty and chaos he created, toying with investigators like a cat with its prey. The validity of his claims remained impossible to verify, leaving open the question of whether they were the boasts of a disturbed mind or glimpses into an even darker reality. The only concrete confirmation came in January 2001, when investigators finally discovered the remains of Shiana and Amber in the Santa Cruz Mountains, a discovery that brought both closure and renewed heartbreak to the community. This grim finding validated at least part of Anderson's confession, while leaving many questions eternally unanswered. The discovery of what happened to the previous victim was heartbreaking. She had been found in terrible condition, starved, beaten, and drugged. Curtis had been using her as a test subject, injecting her with various illegal drugs while recording the horrible things he did to her. The investigators believe she died from an overdose of these substances, though her body was never found. A disturbing pattern emerged during the investigation. They learned that Curtis had a specific way of operating. He would kill one victim and immediately start hunting for his next target. If Mitzi hadn't managed to escape, showing incredible bravery for such a young girl, Curtis would have continued his terrible crimes across different states, claiming more innocent lives. The courtroom scene was powerful and emotional. Little Mitzi, only 8 years old, sat bravely in the same room as the man who had tortured her. She clutched her teddy bear tightly. It had become her source of comfort and strength. Despite her young age, she spoke with remarkable courage, describing in detail the horror she had endured for those terrifying 2.5 days. Her family watched with pride, unaware that their daughter's real battle was only beginning. The investigation expanded beyond Mitzi's case. Witnesses came forward with crucial information about Shiana's disappearance. Several people remembered seeing Curtis talking to her at a gas station in Vallejo on December 9th, 1999, the day she vanished. Others recalled seeing him approach her on the street in the days before she disappeared. However, without Amber's body or concrete evidence, they couldn't charge him for her murder. Still, the jury found enough evidence to convict Curtis for kidnapping Mitzi and murdering Shiana. He was sentenced to death but died from kidney failure while on death row in 2009. But surviving Curtis's torture was only the beginning of Mitzi's struggles. What followed at school became another kind of nightmare. At first, it started with curiosity. Students and even teachers would constantly ask her about what happened. They didn't seem to understand how painful it was for her to keep reliving those memories. Then the bullying began. Some children were incredibly cruel, saying terrible things like she deserved what happened to her or that she should have died instead of surviving. Others accused her of enjoying the attention her story brought, showing how little they understood about trauma and pain. Perhaps the most tragic part was that while Mitzi had shown incredible strength in escaping her kidnapper, she now faced a different kind of prison, one built from whispers, pointing fingers, and cruel words. The same community that had once celebrated her bravery now seemed to turn against her, making her relive her trauma in a different way. She needed support and understanding, but instead found herself fighting a new battle, this time against the cruelty of her peers. The aftermath of trauma ripples through time like stones cast into still waters. For an 8-year-old child who survived kidnapping, those ripples became devastating waves. While her parents desperately tried to anchor their daughter through the storm, society's indifference only deepened the wounds. The halls of her school, once a place of learning and friendship, transformed into corridors of whispers and stares. Post-traumatic stress disorder wrapped around young Mitzi's mind like thorny vines, tightening with each passing day. The mandated psychotherapy sessions felt like futile attempts to untangle what had become hopelessly knotted. By 14, she had abandoned both therapy and hope, turning instead to the numbing embrace of alcohol and drugs to dull the razor-sharp edges of her memories. At 15, home became just another place to run from. The streets welcomed her with open arms, offering belonging through a local gang that didn't ask questions about her past. Violence became her new language, and chaos her comfort zone. Unconfirmed whispers of robberies followed in her wake, though only the scars from countless fights could tell the true story of those dark days. Then came 2009, her 16th year, when fate dealt another cruel hand. A drunk driving accident at 62 miles per hour sent her body through the windshield while her friend, protected by his seatbelt, walked away largely unscathed. For 2 weeks, she danced with death in a coma while skilled surgeons pieced together her shattered form like a broken mosaic. But sometimes light finds its way through the smallest cracks. During her recovery, doctors discovered an unexpected miracle. Mitzi was carrying a child, a baby girl. In that moment, looking down at the ultrasound image, she saw herself reflected in this unborn soul, another innocent life teetering on the edge of circumstance. This time, though, she had the power to change the story. With newfound purpose, Mitzi began rebuilding herself from the foundation up. Detoxification became her battle, therapy her guide, and her unborn daughter, the North Star leading her toward redemption. In the end, it wasn't the trauma that defined her story, but the choice to break its cycle, ensuring her daughter's first chapter would begin with hope rather than pain. Motherhood became Mitzi's compass, guiding her away from the treacherous waters of her past toward a shore of purpose. With her daughter's first cry, a new chapter began, one written not in the ink of trauma, but in the promise of protection and change. In the months following her daughter's birth, Mitzi channeled her hard-won wisdom into action. Her past, once a heavy burden, transformed into a powerful tool for change. She began visiting schools and community centers, armed with a mission that burned bright in her heart: to prevent other children from experiencing the horror she had endured at 8 years old. Her presentations weren't mere lectures. They were survival guides wrapped in stories, teaching children to recognize the subtle signs of danger that she had learned too late. Through hundreds of school visits, Mitzi's voice carried the weight of experience as she taught young ones about stranger danger, self-protection, and the importance of trusting their instincts. The volunteer work ignited a larger vision. Mitzi established her own foundation dedicated to supporting kidnapping survivors and their families, creating a sanctuary of understanding that she wished had existed during her own darkest days. Her program evolved into a comprehensive platform that bridged the gap between survival and healing. Life had tested Mitzi twice, first through kidnapping, then through near death, and twice she had emerged stronger. But perhaps her greatest triumph wasn't in surviving, but in transforming her trauma into a shield for others. That brave 8-year-old girl who helped put Curtis Anderson behind bars had grown into a warrior for change, proving that sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest gifts to the world.